So today I would like to share with you this glorious double bass made by George Craske. George Craske was a very prolific maker who made loads of instruments. He was born in 1795 and died in 1888. Which is a very long life, and he made many instruments. And when he died, he basically died and his estate was worth a fortune. So I think that tells you how successful he was. Yeah, he made, I think, even as many as nearly 3,000 instruments, of which about 20 were double basses. Well, we're very lucky to have, a fair number left, including this example made in 1860 in Manchester, which is his best example. This is the most perfect example of his work, later period, and we'll dig into having a look at this instrument in a minute. So George Craske was born in Bury St Edmunds, and his father was a bandsman in the Suffolk militia. And that's obviously the musical connection. And he got into violin making and left for London, which was, the most active place at the time. He went on to study work under William Forster III and moved on to Thomas Dodd. Now, it's a really interesting connection that he worked there. Thomas Dodd's idea for double bass was to make a giant violin. So Dodd basses have sort of squared off corners most of the time, and that's a good idea for strength of the corner, but also it gives, when you're looking at it, the impression of much wider corners. A double bass corner, in relative to a violin, violins have got massive corners. If you blew a violin up to the size of a bass, the corners would be huge. And so Dodd's idea was to do that. And Craske also kept the same idea. Unlike, many of the other makers, after he left London, he established himself and moved around quite a few times to different areas. He established first in Bath, he spent time in Leeds, he went to Sheffield, he spent time in Birmingham, and eventually landed in Manchester, which is where this bass was made. The violin was really making a giant violin was his idea. And this has got, and is a really good example of that. So this is a later period one. The earlier ones, you can often find them with a purfling line on the front and the back. The idea being, I think in his mind, is this is where the violin ended and the bass, the building up the shoulders, that was where the bass began. And so you could really end up with what looked like a giant violin with a little upsweep at the top. His earlier ones are usually dark varnish, can be a little bit crude. And the sound holes, which is another interesting thing, Thomas Dodd sound holes are usually kind of the Cremonese or certainly the Amati style. These are sort of his own design. They're a lot more old-fashioned, I think, in their design, quite curly and a bit more sort of Steinery, I suppose, in some ways. But he kept that, even though having spent time at Dodd's workshop, this was his idea. And this, if you really look at the outline, it is like a giant violin. It just squished the top down slightly. And it really does feel like that. The arching is, which I'll move it around a little bit so I hope you can see it. But the arching is incredibly violin-like and not like a double bass. Basses tend to have more of a barrel down the middle, but this is very full in here and down here. And so it really feels like a sort of giant violin top. Same thing, it's got very big, chunky kind of edge work with sort of fairly wide purfling. And again, that gives the feeling of a violin. And usually, if you're going to look at stuff, obviously softwood settles a bit and is soft. So you get the better idea of exactly what he was going for in the edge work from the back. We'll talk about this in a minute. You can see a very deep kind of purfling channel and a very, very thick feeling edge here. And again, very wide corners, much wider than you'd find on many basses, giving the impression of a violin. And I think the most violin part for me is the arching on the back, the lower back. I don't know how well that's going to come across on the video, but that really feels like, it just looks like a violin blown up, which I think is very cool. This would have been a sort of rounded button here, but this has been reduced a little over the time. Now, the Stravinsky signature. This bass was known from 1962 as Igor. It was signed by Stravinsky with a nail during a tour of South Africa and Boulet's a few years afterwards. And I have to say, when I first saw this, I felt a bit like someone had drawn a moustache on the Mona Lisa. It was that kind of like, you know, you've got this incredible piece of art and someone's gone like, you know, drawn that on there. But now I really like it. I think it's a great piece of history. You know, and obviously it's not like it was on the front, you know, it's only when you turn it over and look. And Stravinsky's actually a very rare signature if you can find one. So, you know, you get one free with the bass. And yeah, it's a really gorgeous instrument, his best work by far. There's a twin to this one actually in the States that's very, very similar and similar high quality making. You know, those two basses are, you know, really the most beautiful ones of his making. The varnish, the wood, everything stunning. Very, very interesting is the scroll. Now, if you have a look at it, it looks very small and originally made as a 4-string bass, which you start to see around that time. It's tiny. But if you imagine that this was a violin and you were going to make, relative to a violin size, a scroll, it's actually exactly the right size. And once you kind of see that, when you start to look at basses, actual double basses, they are actually, if you took a violin, they would have the most enormous heads on them. And this is exactly as it would be, the ratio of this is exactly as it would be for if this was a violin, which I think is super interesting. And original scrolls, or certainly ones with original peg boxes on Craske instruments, are extremely rare. And sort of it all suddenly makes sense when you understand the ratios of this. Gorgeous Manchester machine heads, which I think are lovely. They're the kind that sort of hold themselves in. So this is the gears are kind of scooped in like that, and the winding part holds the worm holds them on, which is absolutely typical Manchester. Original plates. It's super cool, you know. And he really captures. This is really the Craske idea here. This is exactly like it would be on a violin. Yeah, it's an amazing instrument. It sounds incredible as well. Yeah, gorgeous. We did the neck. You know, we're very pleased to have had it through here, and you know, placed it into a great home. And yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed seeing that, and thank you for watching.